Skies of Fire. Chapter 4. Grantham Interlude. Grantham announced itself with industrial pragmatism, a railway station of Victorian brick and iron, surrounded by the utilitarian architecture of a town that prioritized function over beauty. After Oxford's ancient splendor, the contrast was jarring. "Not exactly Christchurch, is it?" Cal remarked as we disembarked into a gusty November morning, collar turned up against the biting wind. I surveyed our new surroundings, taking in the smoke-stained buildings and distant factory chimneys. Definitely not the Italian Riviera either. "Gentlemen," Springs called, assuming his sergeant's authority, "form up by the exit. Transport to Harroby Camp should be waiting." We gathered our belongings and assembled as directed, a more disciplined group now than we had been weeks earlier. Oxford had instilled not just knowledge, but military bearing, a subtle transformation visible in straighter postures and more coordinated movements. Army trucks waited outside the station, canvas-covered vehicles already spattered with mud from country roads. We loaded our gear and ourselves, then endured a jarring 15-minute ride to Harroby Camp, located on the outskirts of Grantham. The landscape rolled past in monochrome: brown fields, gray sky, occasional clusters of stone cottages amid bare trees. Harroby Camp itself presented an even starker contrast to Oxford. Rows of wooden barracks arranged with military precision stretched across a windswept plain. Drill grounds marked with white lines occupied central areas, while specialized training buildings stood at regular intervals. Everything was temporary, practical, and unmistakably martial. "Home, sweet home," Bird muttered as our truck passed through the main gate. A British sergeant major met us at the administration building, a squat structure distinguished from its neighbors only by the flagpole outside. He was the physical embodiment of his rank, barrel-chested, mustached, with the parade ground voice that could be heard across an airfield. "Welcome to Harroby Camp," he announced, somehow making it sound both like a greeting and a threat. "I am Sergeant Major Barrett. For the next 4 weeks, you will be under my direct supervision as you learn everything there is to know about the Vickers and Lewis machine guns, the weapons that might save your lives when you finally get your backsides into the air." He surveyed our ranks with the critical eye of a man who had seen thousands of recruits pass through his command, most headed for danger, many for death. "You will be housed in Barracks D and E," he continued. "Meals at 0600, 1200, and 1800 hours in the mess hall. First training session begins at 0800 tomorrow. I suggest you use today to settle in and prepare yourselves. Any questions?" There were none. The sergeant major nodded once, dismissing us with a parade ground about face that was a small masterpiece of military precision. We were left to find our own way to the assigned barracks, navigating by the stenciled letters visible on each building's door. Barracks D proved to be a long, narrow building divided into sleeping areas with 8 bunks each. Cal, Springs, Stokes, and I found ourselves assigned to the same section, along with Bird, Kelly, Curtis, and McCurry, our original group from the Carmania, preserved by whatever administrative logic governed such assignments. "Upper or lower?" Cal asked as we approached a set of bunks. "Lower," I replied, dropping my bag onto the indicated bed. Less distance to fall when Sergeant Major Barrett's voice wakes us at dawn. Springs claimed a bunk by the single window, a position that offered marginally better light for reading. "Better than I expected," he remarked, testing the thin mattress. At least we have real beds instead of hammocks. The afternoon was spent organizing our living space according to military regulations. Uniforms hung precisely. Personal items stored in designated areas. Boots arranged at the foot of each bunk. The barracks offered minimal comfort, but functional efficiency. A physical embodiment of our current purpose: to learn a specific set of skills in the shortest possible time. Dinner in the mess hall introduced us to another aspect of Harroby Camp life: integration with British cadets, who viewed us with mingled curiosity and assessment. We found seats at a long table, already half occupied, by young men in Royal Flying Corps uniforms, their conversation pausing briefly as we joined them. "You lot the Americans, then?" asked one, a freckled youth with the accent I'd come to identify as distinctly Northern English. "What gave it away?" Cal replied with a smile. "The uniforms or the accents?" The Englishman grinned. "Bit of both. Plus, you're all so bleedin' tall. What do they feed you over there?" "Optimism and independence," Springs suggested dryly, earning appreciative chuckles from both sides of the table. The British cadets were curious about America, about our training, about our impressions of England. We were equally curious about their experiences, particularly those who had already begun flight training. "What's it like?" Bird asked one cadet, who mentioned having soloed in a Maurice Farman. "The first time up alone." The British cadet considered the question. "Terrifying," he admitted finally. "Then exhilarating. Then terrifying again when you remember you've got to land the bloody thing." "Any advice?" Curtis pressed. "Don't crash," the cadet replied with a perfectly straight face, then broke into a smile at our expressions. "Seriously, though, trust your training. The aircraft wants to fly. Just help it do what it's designed for." This pragmatic approach characterized the British cadets generally: minimal drama, practical advice, occasional dark humor. Many had brothers or friends already serving at the front, some already lost. Their perspective was shaped by proximity to the war's realities, a closeness we Americans were only beginning to appreciate. After dinner, we explored the camp, familiarizing ourselves with the layout and facilities. The machine gun training areas were easily identifiable by the earthen berms behind them, and the distinctive smell of cordite that lingered even hours after the day's practice had ended. Separate buildings housed classrooms for technical instruction, while open spaces served for disassembly drills and maintenance training. 4 weeks of this, Cal mused as we completed our circuit. Learning to kill from the air. "Better to know it thoroughly than partially," Springs replied. "A jammed gun at 15,000 feet is more than an inconvenience." His comment underscored the deadly serious purpose of our training, a purpose sometimes obscured by academic surroundings or distant horizons. Here at Harroby Camp, with the constant crack of practice fire in the background, the reality was impossible to ignore. We were learning to kill efficiently, or we would be killed instead. The next morning established the pattern for our stay. Reveille at 0530, breakfast at 0600, assembly at 0745, training from 0800 until 1800, with a brief break for lunch. After dinner, we were expected to clean and maintain the weapons we'd used that day, then study technical manuals until lights out at 2200. The schedule was relentless, designed to instill not just knowledge, but muscle memory, the ability to operate complex machinery under stress without conscious thought. Our primary instructor was a lieutenant named Blackwood, a former infantry officer who had transferred to the Royal Flying Corps after being wounded on the Somme. His left arm remained partially paralyzed, rendering him unfit for piloting, but not for teaching. The injury gave particular weight to his instructions on weapon maintenance. "This," he told us on our first morning, holding up a Vickers machine gun, "is as important as your aircraft's engine. Without it, you're just taking a very expensive and dangerous sightseeing tour of the Western Front." The Vickers became our constant companion, a water-cooled, belt-fed mechanism capable of firing 450 rounds per minute. We learned to assemble and disassemble it blindfolded, to diagnose jams by sound and feel, to calculate trajectory adjustments for different altitudes and speeds. Hours were spent practicing until our fingers bled from pinches and scrapes, then practicing more. "Again," Lieutenant Blackwood would command after inspecting our work. "Faster this time. Fritz won't wait while you fumble with the feed mechanism." Alongside the Vickers, we studied the Lewis gun, an air-cooled weapon with a distinctive circular magazine that held 97 rounds. Lighter and more portable than the Vickers, it was often mounted on a flexible ring for observer gunners in two-seater aircraft. Its mechanisms were different enough from the Vickers to require separate mastery, doubling our workload. Physical training continued as well, often in weather that seemed determined to test our endurance. November in Lincolnshire brought sleet, freezing rain, and occasional snow, turning the drill grounds to mud and the firing ranges to misery. We ran, climbed, wrestled, and performed calisthenics regardless of conditions, developing the physical resilience necessary for operating open cockpit aircraft in similar weather. "If you think this is cold," Sergeant Major Barrett would bellow as we shivered through morning exercises, "wait until you're at 15,000 feet, with nothing between you and the Arctic but a thin leather jacket. This is a bloody tropical vacation by comparison." Evenings offered our only respite, brief hours in the barracks or the small camp canteen, where we could write letters, play cards, or simply rest aching muscles. The camaraderie that had begun aboard the Carmania and deepened at Oxford now solidified into something approaching brotherhood, a unity born of shared hardship and common purpose. Blackwood had me disassemble and reassemble that Vickers 18 times today, Bird complained one evening, nursing raw fingertips. Said I was still 2 seconds too slow on the final attempt. "Better to get it right here than wrong up there," Springs remarked, not looking up from the technical manual he was studying. "Easy for you to say," Bird retorted. "You got it perfect on your 5th try." Springs shrugged. "Different aptitudes. You're better at physical drills than I am." "Fat lot of good that'll do me if my gun jams and a Fokker puts a hole through my head." "Then practice 19 times tomorrow," Cal suggested practically. "And be grateful Blackwood cares enough to make you repeat it until it's second nature." Such exchanges became our evening ritual. Complaints followed by perspective. Frustration balanced by determination. We pushed each other as much as our instructors pushed us, aware that our collective success would depend on individual mastery. Weekends brought limited freedom. Saturday afternoons and Sundays were typically unscheduled, allowing exploration of Grantham or the surrounding countryside. The town itself offered modest entertainments. Pubs, with restricted wartime hours, a cinema showing mostly patriotic newsreels, shops with increasingly limited inventory due to rationing. On our second weekend, Cal, Springs, and I ventured into Grantham proper, seeking a change of scenery and perhaps a meal not prepared by army cooks. The November afternoon was already fading toward evening as we walked the high street, its shop windows dimmed in preparation for blackout regulations. "There," Cal said, pointing to a pub called the King's Head. "Looks promising." The establishment proved to be a typical English public house. Dark wood paneling, low ceilings, the mingled scents of beer, tobacco, and coal fire. A modest crowd occupied the tables and bar. Older men exempt from military service, women doing jobs their husbands had left behind, a few soldiers on leave or assigned to local duties. We found a table in the corner, drawing curious glances from the locals. American uniforms were still a novelty in smaller English towns, particularly those further from London or major ports. A barmaid approached, middle-aged efficient, with the perpetually tired expression of someone working longer hours for less pay than before the war. "What'll it be, then?" she asked, pencil poised over a small notepad. Cal ordered beers for all of us, adding a request for whatever food might be available. The barmaid nodded and departed, returning minutes later with 3 pints of dark ale and the information that the kitchen could provide meat pies and potatoes if we were willing to wait. "We've got nowhere else to be," Springs assured her with his most charming smile. As we sipped our drinks, I watched the room. 2 domino players were missing limbs, one an arm, the other a leg. Wounded veterans presumably returned to whatever civilian work they could still perform. They played with the focused concentration of men grateful for simple pleasures, their injuries worn with neither pride nor shame, but matter-of-fact acceptance. "You boys aviators, then?" asked one of the domino players, breaking the unspoken barrier between tables. Springs nodded. "In training, machine guns at Harroby Camp." The man nodded, tapping his wooden leg. "Infantry, myself. Some, 1916. Bit of advice if you don't mind. Stay in the air. Ground's a dangerous place in this war." His companions chuckled, the dark humor of men who had seen too much to take anything entirely seriously anymore. We smiled in acknowledgement, aware of the peculiar inversions of modern warfare, where earth might be more dangerous than sky, where staying above the mud and wire might offer better chances of survival. As darkness fell and blackout restrictions took full effect, we made our way back to Harroby Camp, walking through streets lit only by the occasional shielded beam of a military vehicle. The town seemed to fold in upon itself at night, windows covered, doors secured, public spaces emptied by regulation and common sense. "Good people," Cal remarked as we passed the last houses and turned onto the road leading to the camp. "Reserved, but decent." "They've adjusted," Springs said, "to shortages, to losses, to the way the war has changed everything. Makes you wonder if America will have to make the same adjustments before this is over." The training intensified as November progressed. Technical knowledge was supplemented by practical application, firing live ammunition at ground targets, practicing the rapid clearing of jams, learning to coordinate with other gunners in simulated aerial formations. The weather deteriorated further, adding natural challenges to those designed by our instructors. "This isn't even proper English winter yet," Lieutenant Blackwood informed us cheerfully one particularly miserable morning, sleet plastering his uniform to his body. Just wait until January. Something to look forward to, Curtis muttered, earning a bark of laughter from the lieutenant. Indeed, Mr. Curtis, though I suspect most of you will be experiencing the delights of French winter by then, slightly less damp, considerably more lethal. His casual reference to our likely deployment sent a ripple through the group. Not fear exactly, but heightened awareness. Our training was not abstract preparation for some distant possibility. It was specific readiness for imminent reality. The front loomed closer with each passing day, each completed exercise, each skill mastered. In our third week at Harroby Camp, we received unexpected visitors. American officers from the newly established U.S. Air Service headquarters in London. They arrived in staff cars, distinguished by their clean uniforms and administrative bearing from those of us engaged in daily training. We were assembled in one of the larger classrooms. Our training schedule interrupted for what was described as an informational briefing. The delegation was led by a lieutenant colonel, whose name I missed in the formal introductions. A man with the polished appearance and confident manner of someone whose war was being fought with paperwork rather than bullets. Gentlemen, the colonel began, I'm here to update you on developments affecting your deployment once your training is complete. As you know, America officially entered this war in April. Since then, we've been building our air capabilities alongside our ground forces. The process has been complex. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The U.S. Air Service is still in its formative stages. Aircraft production, training facilities, and organizational structures are being developed as rapidly as possible. However, the immediate need for combat pilots exceeds our current capacity to train and equip them entirely through American resources. Another pause. Another careful selection of phrases. Therefore, arrangements have been made with our British and French allies for qualified American pilots to be temporarily attached to their aerial units until our own squadrons can be fully established. This means that some of you, perhaps many of you, will serve initially with Royal Flying Corps or French Air Service squadrons, though you will remain commissioned officers in the United States Army. The announcement generated a buzz of whispered comments and questions. The colonel held up a hand for silence. I understand this raises many questions. Let me address the most immediate. Yes, you will be under British or French tactical command while attached to their units. No, this does not affect your status as American officers. Yes, you will eventually be transferred to American squadrons as they become operational. No, we cannot provide exact timelines for when that will occur. More questions followed, about uniforms, about pay, about chains of command. The colonel and his staff answered with bureaucratic precision, providing information without quite addressing the underlying concerns. Would we be seen as fully American while serving under foreign flags? Would our contributions be recognized by our own military? Would we be forgotten in the shuffle of competing national priorities? After the officers departed, returning to London and their administrative duties, we were left to process this new information. The afternoon's training continued as scheduled, but conversations during breaks and after dinner revolved entirely around the implications of the colonel's announcement. Doesn't change anything essential, Springs pointed out as we sat in the barracks that evening. We're still going to fly, still going to fight the same enemy. Under someone else's command, Bird countered. Taking orders from British or French officers who might see us as second-class additions. Or who might value experienced pilots regardless of nationality, Cal suggested. They've been at this longer than we have. There's something to be said for learning from them directly. The debate continued. Opinions divided between those who saw the arrangement as practical necessity and those who viewed it as somehow diminishing our status as American forces. I found myself in the former camp, more concerned with effectiveness than appearances. Does it really matter what flag is painted on the aircraft? I asked during a lull in the discussion. We volunteered to fight, not to stand on ceremony. Springs nodded agreement. Exactly. The objective is to win the war, not to ensure every American fights exclusively under American command. That's a luxury we haven't earned yet. His perspective gradually prevailed, at least among our immediate circle. The wider debate continued throughout the camp, but increasingly focused on practical questions rather than matters of national pride. Which aircraft we might be assigned to, which sectors of the front were most active, which commanding officers had reputations for keeping their pilots alive. These became our primary concerns. The final week of training brought evaluations, tests of our technical knowledge, our practical skills with both Vickers and Lewis guns, our physical readiness for combat flying. The standards were exacting, failures requiring immediate remedial training and retesting. No one would proceed to actual flight instruction without demonstrating absolute competence with the weapons that might determine survival. I passed my evaluations with solid if unspectacular results. Springs, unsurprisingly, received top marks in technical areas, while Cal excelled in the practical applications requiring steady nerves and physical coordination. Bird struggled with the finer points of mechanical troubleshooting, but compensated with exceptional accuracy in target practice. Our last evening at Harroby Camp found us gathered in the barracks, packing our meager belongings for the next morning's departure. We would be moving again, this time to Thetford in Norfolk, for the commencement of actual flight training. After weeks of preparation, we would finally take to the air. Hard to believe we're actually going to fly soon, Curtis remarked, folding a uniform shirt with military precision. Seems like we've been preparing forever without getting off the ground. That's the point, Springs replied. Better to spend weeks learning on the ground than minutes dying in the air because you missed something important. Always the optimist, Kelly teased. Springs grinned. Just practical. Flying is the easy part. Staying alive while doing it, that's the challenge. Later, with packing complete and lights out approaching, Cal, Springs, and I stepped outside for a final look at Harroby Camp. The night was clear for once, stars visible in the cold November sky. In the distance, we could see the lights of Grantham, diminished by blackout restrictions, but still marking human presence in the darkness. Not sorry to be leaving, Cal admitted, breath fogging in the chill air. But I can't say I haven't learned anything useful here. That's Blackwood's doing, I said. Man's a natural teacher. Springs nodded agreement. Wonder how many lives he's saved without ever knowing it. Pilots who remembered his training when everything went wrong 15,000 feet up. The thought was sobering. How our survival might depend on lessons learned here. Skills practiced until they became reflex. Knowledge absorbed under this lieutenant's demanding instruction. Thetford tomorrow, Cal said after a moment of silence. Wonder what that will bring. Aircraft, presumably, Springs replied with dry humor. It would be a significant oversight in a flight training facility otherwise. His comment broke the momentary solemnity, reminding us that for all the serious purpose of our training, we remained young men on an adventure, still capable of finding humor in our circumstances. Morning brought familiar military efficiency. Early wake-up, final barracks inspection, breakfast, and assembly for departure. Lieutenant Blackwood and Sergeant Major Barrett were present to see us off, their expressions suggesting they had performed this ritual many times before and would do so many times again, sending successive waves of trained cadets toward the front. "Gentlemen," Blackwood addressed us one final time, "you have completed the machine gun portion of your training. Remember what you've learned here, not just the technical details, but the mindset. In aerial combat, the difference between living and dying often comes down to seconds. Make them count." Sergeant Major Barrett was more succinct. "Don't disappoint us by getting yourselves killed stupidly. We've invested too much time in you for that." His gruff farewell drew appreciative laughter, the perfect encapsulation of the practical, unsentimental approach that had characterized our Grantham Interlude. We boarded the trains that would carry us to Thetford with a new confidence, not the naive enthusiasm of our departure from America, but the earned assurance of men who had mastered specific, essential skills. As the train pulled away from Grantham Station, I watched the town recede, then disappear around a bend in the tracks. We had arrived as cadets with theoretical knowledge. We departed as gunners with practical capability. The distinction might seem subtle from the outside, but we felt it acutely. Another threshold crossed, another layer of civilian identity shed, another step closer to the men we were becoming. Cal, seated beside me, nudged my arm and pointed out the window. "Look there." A solo aircraft moved across the sky, tiny from our distance, but unmistakably an aeroplane rather than a bird. Its presence seemed like a sign, a promise of what awaited us at Thetford. After weeks of preparation, we would soon join it in that element, leaving the solid certainty of Earth for the volatile freedom of air.
Enjoying the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new chapter. Episodes drop every week. Be part of the adventure. And if you're hooked, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your support helps keep the story alive.